I've
Hello, everyone. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of your Thursday to be here with us in this conversation that I think is very critical in this moment. Before we begin, just wanted to introduce what we're doing here, and then also our panelists, and starting off with a couple of thank yous as well and showing gratitude. So I'd like to thank Tanit for organizing and helping us kind of get through all the nitty-gritty points of how we're going to bring this all together. Thank you, Kiki Kapani ji, and all the others at Sikh Foundation that have contributed and collaborated to help bring us into this conversation as well. Specifically, this web series is called Sikhs in Action. It's launching this month with the support of the Sikh Foundation, of course, in collaboration with Professor Nirvigar Singh and the Sarbjit Singh Aurora Chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies at UC Santa Cruz. Now, the Six in Action webinar series, it's a six-part series that's dedicated to highlighting how Sikh community leaders and nonprofit organizations bring the spirit of seva into practice today. So what does that mean to be a person who is involved in seva in the current political moment? My name is Dr. Amrit Diol. I'm an assistant professor of Asian American Studies here at Fresno State University. As a historian, my research interests include race, religion, empire, and labor in the American West and the broader Sikh diaspora in the early 20th century. I'm also currently serving as executive board member of the Sikh American History Project, which is a grassroots project dedicated to unearthing, preserving, and promoting Sikh American history. Today, we have an amazing guest that I'm so excited to speak to. Her name is Manpreet Kaur, which many of you may be familiar with. Manpreet Kaur is a Bakersfield native and is the first Sikh Punjabi woman elected to the Bakersfield City Council, where she serves currently as vice mayor. She holds a BA in political science from UC San Diego and a dual master's degree in urban and regional planning and public affairs from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's also the founder of the Kern County chapter of the Jagara Movement, a youth leadership organization serving Punjabi Sikh communities across California. In 2025, she joined the Sikh Coalition as part of its education team and later transitioned into the role of Director of Political Development. So thank you so much, Manpreet. I know we have crossed paths occasionally before, but we've never really been able to sit down and chat. And now we get to sit down and chat. And many people are witnessing that, but I'm so excited to finally learn more about you, to kind of be, as such a central figure and as a Sikh woman in leadership. I'm just very thrilled to be in this conversation with you. Um, so I will start off with a series of questions before we open it up to our audience, and we'll take questions then, because I know many of you are eager to speak with Manpreet as well. But the first series of questions that I have are really about your trajectory, about who you are, a deeper sort of introduction to what brought you to the point that you're at now. So I wanted to ask, can you describe your pathway from community-oriented work with organizations such as Sikh Coalition now and Jakarta before to holding elected office? And what experiences or moments shaped that transition and drew you to this work?
well, thank you first and foremost, Amrit, for the very generous introduction and to the Sikh Foundation and our chair at the UC Santa Cruz site, campus site. I know so many students go through our university systems are just as delighted to know that career pathways in higher education and academia do exist and are all possible careers. And Amrit, I know that you stand in that position as well and give that beacon of hope for our young students as well. So thank you for being a pillar in our Central Valley community as well as to future Sikh academics. So when you're along your journey, you don't really know that all the pieces will make sense at some point, but I feel I followed a non-traditional career path as I compare it to those maybe my peers as well as those in other careers. As I was along the way, I feel like I did the normal thing that us first generation kids kind of do in pursuing higher education. leaving our hometowns. Of course, I was born and raised here in the Central Valley of California, the Southern Central Valley, where unless you are being trained to go off and study, sometimes our families are from blue collar beginnings, and you are pursuing your education locally. So leaving home for college was a big deal, and you quickly realize that the world is much bigger than your hometown. So while I was studying, I always found myself defending my hometown. I was always thinking about the place that I was from, and I would say those roots started early in Punjabi school and being involved with the community, and those seeds being planted by my parents and making sure that we spent every Wednesday and Friday through Sunday at the Gurdwara. And having grown up in a generation that experienced some of pre 9/11, of course, post 9/11, Gurdwaras really became the space where you saw familiar faces and felt a sense of belonging. And so I think I've always chased that same feeling in the work I do and in the seva I pursue. And of course, now turning a career into this hybrid seva sort of thing. It was upon returning from undergrad that I realized that I wanted to stay in the community, and it was perfect timing with connecting with Jakarta members and volunteers as the organization was also expanding in the Fresno region and beyond. To start the Bakersfield and the Southern California chapters in a bigger way, and upon kind of engaging with my local community, we all have a sense that maybe we know and understand our hometowns in an intimate way. And I always say our hometowns are like our siblings. We love them, but we also know their areas of growth. And it was actually when I was a community organizer working with families that I knew and didn't know that I really was able to learn in depth what the diversity of experience was of families, both Sikh and non-Sikh, and build coalitions across ethnic communities locally to work on education equity, economic justice, health justice, and so many causes that intersect with the experience of our own community, which really set the stage for me to be interested in how policy can really improve the lives of people I love and people kind of in a more broad way, which led me to pursue grad school in the same way. And I share all of that because it was non-traditional along the way. What I was studying, I'm studying urban planning. I think along the way I was always kind of explaining to my parents what I was studying, and it was like, okay, great, like as long as it makes you happy. But I'm very much glad I did because I think it forced me to really understand deeply and in a meaningful way how our worlds are designed both in the physical sense, and how we design our buildings and our cities, but also the essence of those communities and cities really being the people and that sangat. And so I got to practice that both as a community organizer and somebody who studied city planning. And it was that same community that I built relationships with as a community organizer that then encouraged me to run for city council. And that was not a part of my plan, absolutely. But it was also, in the words of my community and those kind of advising, saying, we've done the work in creating our institutions through our Gurdwara. And politics is not new to Sikhs. We understand politics in a deep and meaningful way. And it really is our turn to be within local government so that we can feel a part of the fabric of a community that we call home. And so with that encouragement, running for city council, and now in the last year of my first term, I can say throughout that experience, really Sikhi has stayed and has always been that North Star for me in terms of being a community organizer, and then, making that really inspiring and pushing me to what I eventually studied, and then returning in finding meaning as to what my why was of running for office, staying in office, and seeing the benefits. And really that translates to thinking forward. And since taking office, my goal has always been to make sure that Sikh youth are experiencing local governance from within, promoting them to being on boards and commissions, and keeping them involved and encouraging them to apply for even city jobs, and making sure that they can be a part of these systems where decisions are being made. And So I would start there and kind of say that they're while in it, you don't really see how all the pieces connect, but eventually they do, and you graduate from one kind of program to the next as they kind of sew together.
Thank you. That gives us a lot of insight in kind of like what brought you to this point. Because I think oftentimes we have, youth especially approach us and say something like, why did you choose to do this? Or how do I get to some place or something like that? And I really appreciated also how you broke down community. I think sometimes there's an understanding that community is one specific thing, but it's actually all these different elements that help shape our journey and it shapes the folks that we want to serve, right? And you mentioned so many in terms of your hometown, your family unit, then sort of your state or the national landscape where you're kind of leaving and going somewhere else for school and then coming back. Then in the Sikh sense, we're talking about Sangat as well as being community. And so all these different various elements that helped kind of fabricate this journey for you or create this journey for you is so beautiful and amazing. So I appreciate that response. In terms of kind of thinking about where we're at right now, I was thinking about grounding some of the stuff that you're doing and having and starting a discussion, which I think our audience might appreciate in terms of what's happening, right? Especially around a role that requires a lot of action, right? Of you, and then specifically from folks that are then putting you in elected positions as well, right? They are active, they're participating and using their political voice. And so thinking about action and what that looks like in practice, what are some of the current challenges that yours and our communities and those like our communities, so those even who are sort of parallel to ours, what are they facing, right? And what are some of the wins that you've experienced in your journey so far?
Thank you for the question. I always think my most meaningful win is when a young God runs up to me and tells me that their teacher asked them if we were related because they're like, our city councilwoman has the same last name as you. And they're like, we just didn't know what to tell her. So we just said yes. And I'm like, we're all related. We are absolutely related by this shared name. So for me, that's a win when young girls start seeing themselves in these not only places of power, but places of representation. And I know we always hear that representation matters, but I always think back to if I was a young Manpreet Kaur in elementary school, what that would have meant to me to see someone come to my school or at the, attending Gurdwara regularly with them, and their name sounds like mine, their name looks like mine, what that would have meant for me and how invincible I would have felt in the different careers I would have thought of seeing myself in, and that really is a goal. It's even more meaningful when I have dads of daughters come up to me because really I felt within even while we were campaigning during the election that there was this narrative change that we were able to kind of unlock and. It's no secret that, we have within even the Sikh community, we have like a multi-generational sort of like immigrant community. Some folks have come when my parents did in the 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s. And then we have folks have come more recently. And within those waves of migration, we now have developed these multi-generations, even locally. So there will be a spectrum of thought. There will be those who are more conservative, more orthodox, and those who do understand that when we see ourselves in places of power, then everything else becomes that much more accessible. But it is when this narrative shift started happening of we also want to see our daughters where you are. And I'm always replying saying, no, I want to see them go further. And for me, that is a win when we are able to change kind of this traditionally patriarchal norms and language and culture to be to kind of like rid ourselves of that and free ourselves of that a little bit in a small but significant way, I think is progress. Within being kind of there's a blessing, but also a responsibility in being the first in a locale. And I know that the beauty of our community also is that our global Sangat is so interconnected. Something meaningful happens, we have a first who accomplishes something, and it's rightfully global news within our Sangat, and that is a tremendous thing that I don't see in other communities. And I was just having a conversation with someone today, and they're like, "Yeah, we posted something about one of the first from our community. We had our first pro tem judge here as well, and they're like." Our post became viral. I'm like, that's just how our community works. We share it far and wide. But a challenge with that is also that within governance, especially local governance, you kind of have to, you're in two positions at once. You're representing the Sikh community, and within that, the diversity of challenges that our community experiences, from economic to familial to representation issues, to legal issues. And one of the largest things we're facing right now is the trucking crisis that has become not only an economic crisis, but also a crisis of discrimination and racism against Sikhs. And trucking is what powers the Central Valley and has become safe work for the Sikh community to do, where you have the autonomy to freely stop your truck when it's time for you to do, part. It's safe for you to wear your dastard and travel, and also have the economic freedom to really determine your destiny. And that's really under threat. And so we're really feeling that pressure. And it's no secret that also, within across our nation, there's an immigration crisis. There's so many systemic issues, but really are we able to use our platforms that we have been granted by the community in order to speak up when the community is experiencing some of its hardest days? And that is the call to action. That is the call to duty as well, as to make sure that we are speaking, and that's really the first thing. I think that's the bare minimum that we can do is speak about it, post about it. And also when our brothers and sisters in other communities are experiencing something, I feel that is why I'm always so grateful that Sikhi is my North Star, because while within politics, there are naturally, just within the environment, there can be things that folks answer to or things that guide them. But I will say that one thing that I am so eternally grateful for is that Sikhi remains that North Star in all that we do. And those things are just built into how we are programmed and how we lead, whether it's those who lead at the Gurdwara, whether it's those who lead in nonprofit organization spaces, whether it's those who are leading in any form of governance. So yeah, I think it's a challenge as well, because you're also then you're governing your district. My constituency is about 65,000 within my ward, but it's, as vice mayor, our city is close to 500,000. So balancing that, I would say it's a responsibility that does come with challenges, because I could be building a park for the city one day, and the next day, we're advocating to try to make sure that there's legal representation for those who have been discriminated within this trucking crisis. And I'm grateful that there are organizations like the Sikh Coalition who are able to do that work. And there's so much more work to do, and so much more shared seva to be done.
Thank you for sharing that, especially considering I think a lot of the folks that are listening today or maybe listening later when this is posted are kind of hearing about constantly what's going on in the country right now, what folks are facing, just because of accessibility as well to knowledge and news and things like that. And so to be able to connect that to what's happening in Bakersfield and within the community, but then also to our parallel communities around, right, as well, that we live amongst, right, that we have a shared responsibility towards. And I also like that you kind of mentioned the responsibility of being the first, which is a beautiful honor, and it's something that, you have many firsts. That's one of the big things about you. But when you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what that looks like, of kind of bearing the responsibility of that and wanting to do well as the first, and building that sort of pathway for others as well, and hopefully a lane in which they can kind of fast track past you, is important, right? There's a lot of building that happens. And so my next set of questions have to do with Sikhi and leadership, and just kind of diving into that a little bit more. And so one of the questions that you kind of mentioned already, but just if we can kind of focus on that a little bit more is, in what ways has Sikhi informed your approach in leadership, decision making, or public service? And one of the key sort of elements that comes to mind, especially for the work that you do for me, is Sarbat Dapala, right? And so you represent a lot of different demographics, whether that's students, youth, Sikh communities, different gendered experiences, and those that are non-Sikh communities as well. What helps you bridge these different experiences, right? How do we serve in a way that's Sikh oriented, that speaks to Sikh values, that kind of invokes, something like Sarbat Tapala in the service that you do, right? In the leadership that you perform.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I always go back to thinking of whenever I'm like stuck or I need inspiration, I'll always just go into like Sikh history and think about, of course, there's so many folks who have done the research that I can reference very easily online. But whether it was Sikh women in leadership and, things that I learned later in life, as an adult when folks had more research emerging and continue to and really always going back to where the inspiration comes from. And I think for myself it always comes from within. Like there's almost this like fire that starts to like kind of erupt, and it's a feeling deep down that's like, this is right, this is not right. Or it's just kind of like folks call it a gut feeling, but I think it's just something like Delon, you feel it within, and it's like, I have to speak up on this, or I need to figure out if I have the information, resources, or knowledge to be able to make some kind of connection here in whatever role I have, to be of service or be of help. And within kind of I always either go back to like Sarbata Bala or like this idea of Kirt of, it doesn't need to have a spotlight on it. It's just keep going and keep doing that work. And I think that goes back to even getting creative and seeing ourselves reflected in some of the policies that we don't see ourselves reflected in. This for me was a big learning moment when we were as a community working on even the 2020 census campaign, where folks were trying to make sure that Sikhi had a box, or the Sikh identity had some sort of box that we could fill in, so we could begin to at least start understanding what our quantifiable numbers are. So, because whenever we would go to any institution or place of decision making, there we would present kind of the experiences of a student or a community or a sub community within our community. And the reply we would always get is, well, what are your numbers in this school district? What are your numbers in this city or within this constituency? And while it shouldn't always be based on quantity, we felt like that was a gap, and policy was trying to meet that gap. But it turned very much into kind of this like cause for our entire community to say, if we're not counted literally, it's like you're ginti, you don't exist basically. And so it's always going back and seeking inspiration in historical figures, historical movements, and knowing that anything we're doing today is not new. It's been done by someone somewhere before within our history. We just have to figure out who did it, how they did it, and the forces behind it. Within kind of, to use like contemporary American examples, we had Congressman Dalip Singh Sond, who had a force of folks behind the scenes who were also propelling that movement, and some names that will go the rest of our lives maybe not knowing, some we do know, but that feel is kind of like the Sikh Siddhant of, we're going to do it for the Sabat Tapala, for the betterment of all, and this will be remembered long beyond any one individual, but that this was done, and that representation mattered to us, mattered to them, matters to us, continues to matter, but also in the small and nimble ways that people continue to pursue. In whatever seva that they're in. And I think any of those specialties are available within Sikhi and have been demonstrated, even in the ways in which we are able to use examples like the like Langar is our most accessible example that is used time and time again to understand the pillars of Sikhi when we're explaining it to a non-Sikh audience. But we use them in ways that I feel so proud of folks that have, whether it was during COVID, whether it's during fires or floods, and really meeting people where they are and just going into action and springing into action, whether you have a force of one, three, or 300. I think that is the Sikh way. And I have examples in front of me every single day that remind me. And I think that's what makes our community so unique. And I feel so grateful that I get to share these examples. And being in this elected office has given me the opportunity to bring other communities in as well. Our Latino community within Bakersfield, the Central Valley in California has been so meaningful in shared lessons, shared existences. But locally, my own constituency is 56% Latino. And so while, it's the idea is that I'm a Sikh elected official, but it's actually the Latino community that elected me. So bringing them in and creating that relationship and them really remarking on the Sikh community and understanding whether it's our events, whether it's just another Sunday, whether it's a personal event, having those solidarities, I feel like is also that Sarbat Tapala that allows for our community to understand those who they are sharing space with, but the reverse as well. And while it might not be kind of this public campaign of telling folks who we are as Sikhs, it invites folks in a way that understands us on a level that's much more meaningful and much more personal.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. And I think it speaks to um, some of the elements that I think a lot of Sikhs in the current age are juggling and they're kind of like thinking about internally in terms of how do I be a Sikh in this current moment. And a lot of it has to do with, like you mentioned, like I think adaptability and how those values can still shape how we move through the world and how we move with other individuals and people in the world as well, right? Whether those are directly in our community or outside of it, right? That we still owe those values to others, right? Regardless of gender, race, class, creed, all of that, right? That there's to be of service means to be of service to all. And just like speaking from my own experience, you know, even within our own roles individually, there's ways to invoke Sikh values, I think, all the time. Just specifically in terms of like seva, right? There's very traditional ways that we do seva where we go to the Gurdwara or there's like langar seva or something, right? And then there's also ways that we try to bring that in. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but it works with the skills that we have. So I think during COVID, I felt like I was like, oh, I don't actually know. I don't really do anything that is sort of essential, right? And
Mhm.
so, how do I still contribute to
Yeah.
what's happening in the world? Um, and it just hit me like, okay, one of the things that I can absolutely do is just be very chatty. And so, if anyone would like to learn about this very niche thing that I talk about in history, like I'm happy to talk about it with anyone, right? Whether that's visiting a school or university or something, and just that's my skill set is just to be, as the kids call now, a yapper. And so I chat a lot, and so that's something that I can do. But I think this sort of approach of adaptability and kind of like really integrating those values in who we are in our lives today can be really useful. Like if someone works in like, let's say, graphic design or something, there's a way that you can contribute to something, right? Like maybe there's a way that you can help a cause, right, with the skill set that you have. And so yeah, so just very beautifully said, right? And so I think for the next few questions, I would love to deep dive a little bit more in the specific areas that you provide service or you work for these communities. And one of the big ones is, of course, our youth, right? Who look towards you for inspiration, who kind of like are trying to learn through that journey as well. Many first generation, second generation, third generation of our youth are kind of looking at this world with open eyes, right, and taking things in. And so education, of course, is very important. And so my questions here are, how has your work in education advocacy shaped your approach to public leadership? And also, how can we empower and support our youth during these times?
Yeah, it's I always try to remind myself that the youth, especially junior high and high school youth, are like the hardest group of people to impress. So you have to be like really cool. You have to know exactly the type of terminology they're saying, the language that they're speaking. I mean, it's like it's a completely different dialect that they speak in. So first and foremost is speaking their language. Um, and I always try to start any conversation I have with anyone who's young is, I was right where you were. I went to this exact high school where we are today. I graduated from right here. I went to the same Gurdwara that you attended. So there is nothing that you can't do that I didn't see that was also a path forward because you have the same resources, if not even more, available to you, and know that this community is here to provide all of those same systems of support and resources. And then it's on you to take it how far you want to go with it. And I feel like even young people in high school, I always point to high school youth because I think they are like the most malleable at that age, junior high and high school, and they're also the most their self-esteem will vary day to day, and so it's really just pouring love and pouring encouragement into them, and really just having normal conversations that make them reassure them that we are accessible and we are here to have everyday conversations with them. Um, it, it's most impactful when there's consistency as well, and being at their schools, being at their gurdwara, and feeling like a true member within a sangat. And in my time with Jakarta, I would always remark on how these young folks are building a youth sangat that then becomes their lifelong friendships. They become their college classmates, and it's kind of built in, and that continuity then evolves as youth go into their different careers, but hopefully always center seva in some way, shape, or form. And I remind them of I kind of share my own trajectory of graduating from one Sikh organization to the next, and that being kind of a natural path as well. We all have our own specialty, whether that's within nonprofit, Sikh nonprofit spaces, whether you are in healthcare, whether you're a doctor, whether you're an attorney, whether you are a teacher, you're an academic, and so forth, whether you are in tech or whether you are in the arts, there is the goal first is to pick your specialty and what you do well, and then turn it towards community, then turn it towards seva, because there is just so much that we can do, and so much that has been done, and so much that continues to do. There is that role for that journalist to play, to write about what our community is experiencing from a community-centric lens. There is so much work for the artist to do who can tell a story from their own lived experiences, but what they're observing in the world and how they're absorbing it. And their lens is going to be so different than the doctor who is seeing the health outcomes of our communities versus the attorney who is saying and seeing different legal routes that they've been able to practice within their own careers, or the teacher who's observing how these students are changing and evolving from one generation to the next, and the most effective way to communicate with them. And so whether it's youth, whether it's a little older than youth, my encouragement is pick what resonates with you as a specialty, and then turn it towards seva, and you'll never be without some sort of seva to do. And especially when the community catches on to what you're doing, you will be voluntold to do plenty. um, but I think all that has shaped how I view what I do and what I always want to do. And for the rest of my life, I want to be in seva to our community in some way, shape, or form, and for it to be useful, and it be something that's actionable and something that can be done, something that can help today, help in the immediate. And I think that's where I probably have honed in my skills at least.
Yeah, that was really nicely said. I think about our youth often. I teach college age, I teach university age, and because I'm a little scared of the younger folks, I don't think my I don't think I can take
I
it.
don't blame you.
Uh,
Yeah.
they are very opinionated, but they bring life into this world, which is amazing. And so I think about in terms of looking at a society, we often think about building or creating, and when we kind of measure out how well a community or how well a country or how well a city is doing, it's often based off of like structural things, right? Of like how clean is this? How built are the roads or the highways, and what does the housing look like? But I think if your youth are very happy, they feel safe, they feel secure, they feel empowered and encouraged, I think that's the best way to also gauge how well a community is doing, right? How safe do they feel in spaces to be able to not only just move through them, but to be able to express themselves freely and find their path forward, right? So it is a very huge part of what we all do, right, in our various sort of sectors and stuff, and especially for you. My next community, like sort of sub community that I wanted to talk about was Sikh American women in leadership, which is also really big as well. This is another one of your firsts. And so, what I wanted to ask you about is what does it mean to be a Sikh American woman in a visible leadership position today? Do you feel like a sense of responsibility, whether that's spoken or unspoken, associated with being one of the few Sikh women in elected office? And my sort of sub question, the second question, has to do with mentorship, right? Which we all kind of experience, whether it's formal or informal. And I wanted to know how that's mattered to you in your journey.
Thank you. I wake up thinking about this every day, but it is so true that it has always been women who not only opened the door, but also like pulled my arm and brought me through the door and sat me at the table and said, "Sit here, share what you're saying. It matters. Your voice matters. You need to speak up on this." And it's that encouragement, whether it was early on and being young in life and having parents that let me really run with what I was doing and being in a Punjabi school of all women teachers or observing the various roles that women occupy in leadership from the home to the Gurdwara again to the careers that they have. And it's seeing that kind of exactly what you said. We could have the infrastructure, but what are we putting within the buildings? What is really creating that essence? And I've always turned towards like the matriarchs and the women, the examples from our own community, whether it was making, Amrit sweeter, or it was leading an army, or it was leading a missile, and those being really inspirational roles that Sikh women have played. And then when I hyper localize it and say, how do those historical and very like inspirational women manifest in the women I'm seeing in the everyday, and without them, what would it look like? And that always brings me back, and all of my teachers having always been women throughout my public school journey, and all of my professors in university being women. So I think I've always turned towards their voice and their leadership in small and significant ways, and in the big and loud ways as well. So I could not and would not be here without a woman always believing in me and encouraging me, and that's what I always hope. And I'll be honest, it's even women that I work with. Whether I worked at Jakarta, it was or the Sikh Coalition. We always joke that there's a predominance of women, and that's always been true in any Sikh space that I've been in. The organizations are almost entirely women led, and I don't think that is by accident. I know it's not by accident. So it's that essence that creates kind of the feeling of a community that can be translated into, okay, how do we help and how do we put a balm on whatever issue is going on, but also how do we excel forward? So I'm incredibly indebted to every woman that's always, whether a BB, from our Bajorg to our babies, it's always women who are coming up and praying over me, and saying, and I think seeing that their lives. And I always tell them that their lives and their work, it translates to what we're able to do, and the fact that we're able to run. And but of course, when you're the first, you want to make sure you're never the last, because then whatever's been done is not, it's not really worth it. So when I first actually entered even the city council role, I wanted to make sure that I elevated Sikh women. And the first person that I was appointing to a commission, our most important at a city level, is your planning commission. This is a person who's approving what is literally built in your city and what gets approved, where the city moves forward. And so I was very honored to be able to appoint a brilliant Sikh woman who's an engineer and has built incredible stadiums and infrastructure across the state. And that was my first appointment. And I continue to make sure that Sikh women have access to the spaces that I have access to. And young women really, I'm always like in conversation with my regular group of like young girls at the Gurdwara, and I'm checking in and seeing what's going on in their lives. And I think for me, that would be enough if they just are able to see that this is just as accessible and has been made accessible in the way that it was made for me. And hopefully that is just continued to be passed forward.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to like this idea of like does or this question that comes up often of like does representation matter? And it absolutely does. You know, when you're the young person, when you're the young woman and you see another Sikh woman or just another woman of any community who is in a leadership position, there's a moment where, you know, you kind of lock eyes and you say like you know, like I see you and they look back often and they say I see you too, right? And that's a very like sort of deep connection, and there's a desire there to seek out mentorship and to seek out, you know, guides right through this journey of life, whether that's your career or just generally. And so, you know, I would not be where I am either without the women mentors in my life on all various levels. And once you kind of get to a position where you can be a sense of authority or that you can provide something to a generation that's younger than you, then there's a deep desire to also bring them to the room, right? And to have more, because you're looking for that sense of community as well, right? So it's an interesting system that kind of is so organic and it's so built in, but it's like something that I think everyone can often relate to of the folks that kind of help push you forward. Um, in my case, it was a woman professor here at Fresno State where I graduated. Who talked to me a year before graduation, just said, would you like to get do you want to get a PhD? And I didn't know really what that entailed. And I was like, well, what can I do with that? Especially as a second generation of like, what can I do with that? Is there some security in that? And she's like, do you want to do this? And she just pointed to herself in her chair. She's like, you could do this, what I'm doing. And it just opened up a whole world for me that I'm so grateful for. But it was one conversation with someone who saw me, right? In a position and kind of like literally saw me sitting in that same position. So it can happen all the time. It's very organic and a very beautiful thing.
Absolutely.
Um, and just so I think wrapping up, because I think folks might be eager to ask their own questions. I have a couple questions for you in thinking about the future, right? And where can we go from here? My first question is about what advice would you give to youth, especially those in marginalized positions, either Sikh or non-Sikh, who are interested in public service, community work, or civic leadership? And then second, looking ahead, how do you envision the future of Sikh American political participation at local levels, at national levels? And what gives you hope right now, right, in your city, in public service, or in the next generation of leaders?
Yeah, it's such a timely question, especially for two reasons. I both wear the hat of being an elected official and also my seva with the Sikh Coalition in the role of directing our political development work. And we've just actually launched a program, and I transitioned from education advocacy policy work to political policy work and development, because at the Sikh Coalition we were also watching how within kind of the Sikh American landscape that we were so incredibly seeing Sikh candidates running for office at all levels, being elected to office across the country in so many different corners. And I had just, in conversation with even our ED, just thinking through what would it look like if we kind of became this hub to train individuals to really imagine ourselves in elected office and really have a more structured, systematic way of recruiting people who, especially non-traditional people who don't see themselves in elected office, but at least just learn the process, learn all the nuts and bolts, what goes into it, practice public speaking, and also creating a network of Sikh elected officials to meet with those who may have interest and really just get the thoughts going, planting the seeds, because really, I feel it's no accident that so many Sikh Americans are coming forward, running for office successfully. We had our few examples across the nation, and then we, of course, would always point to Canada, where there has been success electorally for Sikhs. So within kind of our Sikh American diaspora, it's no accident that we're seeing so many folks emerge and seeing that there are policy answers within elected office that can be sought for all communities. And I do think it's because Sikhi being that North Star, and that's my hope that because of that guiding force, we're able to see ourselves competing in elections and seeing our community being represented in new and different ways. And so at the Sikh Coalition, we've launched this program called Duct, and it is a Sikh political leadership program that will train the next generation of Sikh American elected officials and at least plant those seeds. And I hope anyone who is on the call who's already thinking of someone who you think would be a great addition to this program, I hope you encourage that person to apply and begin learning about, what our shared lessons have been so far of those who are in elected office. I look to State Senator Manka Dhingra in Washington, who has held a seat for as long as she has as a Sikh American, and what lessons can be learned there. And I had the opportunity to meet her last year, and it was just one of those moments, like you had shared, Amrit, when you see each other and they're just like, they just say, keep going. And just as I know you probably share the same experiences of it, it's different when it's like a woman who says it to you and encourages you in that way. To kind of go for the non-traditional things as well. So our hope is that folks can learn the process, the information that, like I said, the nuts and bolts from our own community's shared lessons, and really become kind of like this learning center and learning ground, so that we can lead in. And I think the most important part is that we lead with Sikh principles. We are a community that answers to one another, and that's, it's practiced in so many ways. We just look to the Akal Takht as well as an example of we do answer to one another, and that's what makes our community so special. And that's also why I don't take to heart whenever like auntie or uncles are, giving me some constructive criticism. Like they mean well, but also yes, I do answer to you because I represent you too. And may we always be, may we always answer to our community and make sure that we're upholding our own standards for one another as Sikhs in a way that it makes us proud, and we're making policy decisions as elected officials that keeps Sikhi first and keeps our Sikh Sangat in mind first, and so we don't have to answer for things that don't align. And I think that's it's set. We see other communities practices as well. I always point to one of my mentors, Dolores Huerta, who we are so fortunate to, who is from Kern County, who shows that she, while she's like a global leader and icon, and she always shares that she has a responsibility to, whenever a farm worker meets her from anywhere, she engages in a conversation with them and makes them feel seen in a way, because that is how they primarily see her, and that's who her community is. That's where her start was from. And she's never it's never too big of a task for her to be a note taker at a meeting. And you would be shocked that this 90 plus woman, who is this global human rights and civil rights icon, is volunteering to write notes. But I think this same like nimrata exists across different communities, and we share in that, and that being why the next developing the next generation that of leaders that keep Sikhi at the forefront is so incredibly important right now.
Yeah, thank you for kind of moving us towards a message of hope in a sort of like what can seem like a very contentious moment. And also thinking about the positives of being in our positionality, right? The blessings that we have in terms of being part of a diaspora. There's always a look towards spaces like Punjab, but then we can also look towards what people are doing in other elements because we are trying to be informed by our Sikhi, right? And so there's always going to be shared approaches or folks that we can kind of learn from, right? Um, so in the next section, thank you so much for bearing with my questions
Thank you.
and answering them with so much grace. And so I wanted to open it up to the audience. We have a couple questions that are here. They're specifically in the Q&A. So if you can click on that as well, Manpreet, then I will read them, but just so you can kind of follow along. Um, Now, we have a question from an anonymous attendee, which says, asking regarding minority women reactions, are Sikhs competing with African Americans, Hispanics? Is there a crossover as Jasmeet Bains is apparently doing? White women supportive or are they undermining you? And given then that Kern County has a lot of MAGA.
Thank you for the question. There's so many layers to it. Um, I'll start by saying that what I have found that kind of like you and I were sharing earlier, Amrit, that while it may be women in general of just having this shared experience or shared lived experience, I do feel that, and I always try to find places of commonality first and foremost with women in general whenever I encounter them, and I think that energy is then there's reciprocity there, even if they may be white. And yes, it is true that Kern County is a politically conservative region, but we are also this kind of like rural urban region where we kind of have more in common with the experiences of living in this shared environment, while also, being women. And there are women in leadership who, may be white, they may be of more conservative ideology. But I think I can always point to some point or at some juncture where I've had conversations with the same folks who may outwardly be quite conservative, but in private conversations one-on-one, there's relatability in lived experiences as women who are in leadership, and that tends to give us some point of connection that really humanizes us beyond some of the more dividing lines of race and discrimination. And to the first part of this question in regards to minority women, and if Sikhs are competing with African Americans and Hispanics, or is there a crossover? Um, I think it just depends on person to person. It's really what you prioritize. Actually, just yesterday at our Bakersfield City Council, we honored the first ever Black woman to serve on the Bakersfield City Council. And her name is Dr. Irma Carson. She served for 16 years. And before that, she served on a school district and was just this pillar for our community, really had such a long legacy for women to follow in her footsteps. And since she served, I'm only the second woman to ever be of color to ever be on that city council. And I think that just shows us how much work there is still to do because we have not had a Latina on that board. But I will say that locally and in my own experience and in my practice, I credit this just to being a community organizer before being an elected official, that my priority always is making sure that I'm including those who I don't see in the room, because I know I've been in the position where I've wondered, like, why wasn't my community invited to this table? And I'm always encouraging our tables to be broadened to invite all communities, who don't feel like maybe traditionally they would have been seen within those same rooms or at those tables. And it can be something small. I know we say that in generalities of tables and decision making, but it's also in practical ways of economic policy that we practice at the city. Who's getting grants? Where parks are being built and prioritized in which communities? Are they traditionally underserved, or are we going to continue to build parks in the areas of town that tend to see, good infrastructure year round? So it's bringing those perspectives in and making sure that we can shape policy in a new and different way, that maybe hasn't been seen there before. So I feel my practice is always to link arms. I've given the example of Dolores Huerta, but she's always the one grabbing my arm and throwing me on stage to speak from a podium, whether it's a march or it's just a meeting. And there's not a lot of people that do that actually, and that's what always surprises me is mics aren't usually shared. So it's always really it's always encouraging when you do meet the people that are willing to do that. So I would say that there's not a competition within communities, but there is really a respect and an understanding that we are still up against the same powers that be, and we all have a common oppressor in the ways that, we may be new to systems, we may not be new to systems, but there is still there is still like a persistent leaving out of certain communities, marginalized communities, and that usually manifests in economic and health outcomes.
Yeah, it kind of made me think about being intentional and strategic with identity as well, of when is it going to be um, when is it going to be the most fruitful to say that this is just a sick issue and to be intentional about that in terms of clarifying that and being vocal about that? And then when is it useful to say that an issue speaks to all sorts of communities, right? And bringing in a different title, whether that's Asian American or whether that's person of color or whether that's, religious minority, right? Of being strategic about identity, right? And not being haphazard about it, because what you're trying to do is service to, of course, a broader community, but to kind of think about that. And that's really, really amazing. I'm going to read out the second question that we have in the chat. This is also an anonymous attendee who says, we have seen Sikh women who have been able to move far up within MAGA, such as Harmeet Dillon and Nikki Haley, who is not necessarily Sikh as her parents are. What kind of conversation do you keep at the center when inspiring young people to truly be of service and not fall prey to some of these political ideologues? Um, I'm going to link it in with the second question as well, just so we can kind of get the questions there, because one has just come in. And it says, what have been the key barriers faced by Sikhs in political spaces in the United States, particularly when running for public office? More broadly, do Sikhs as a community lack a strategic narrative building approach to political engagement? And despite having the first Asian American member of Congress, Dalip Singh Sond, there was a prolonged vacuum for many decades in terms of Sikh political representation. Only recently have things begun to shift in a more positive direction, with multiple Sikh mayors and other elected officials now serving across the United States. What factors explain these earlier absence and the more recent momentum? And I think both are really amazing questions because they speak to a current moment and really linking that critically with the past. So take what you want from both and go for it.
No, thank you for the individuals asking these questions. They are really sound and timely questions for us to be reflecting on, I think, as a community, especially because I myself feel this kind of urgency for us to really determine where we would want our community to go in six being in electoral spaces, and what that means and the outcomes of who represents us, how we're represented. And at the end of the day, I think it's a blessing and also a burden at the same time that our global Sangat is so connected. So when someone makes a policy decision and is an elected official, the rest of us do have to answer for their decision. And I feel that as an elected official, and my personal stance is that I have been deeply disappointed that those like Hermeet Dillon who are, have shared have been on a platform to make a decision that could really alleviate our community and some of the crises we're feeling at the hyper local levels. I shared earlier that there is a discrimination that has come along with the economic crisis that Sikhs are facing in trucking. And trucking is the industry in which we have become industry experts, really. And so when it's, the family's mortgage, when I'm receiving calls from men crying and not knowing what the outcomes of their family will be, in response to the hate rhetoric and racism that is coming out of a policy decision by a government or an institution, individuals have stopped driving it altogether. Folks, individuals choose to go to do completely different jobs or are at risk of completely losing their livelihoods. And so I always have a hope that, like, as Sikhs who do get to occupy places of decision making, that those same decision makers are able to, if they're able to understand what their own community is experiencing, then we are able to understand what other communities that are not Sikh are also experiencing, because we all get marginalized in same and different ways. And so I hold on to that hope. But of course, along the way, there is disappointment, and that disappointment can come back at me too. I am not immune to that as well. And I'm sure I can be better in representing our Sikh community, whether it's the policy decisions, whether it's what I speak on and what I haven't spoken on. And knowing that at the end of the day, my hope is always that Sikhi is that North Star that guides us in the same way that I feel like it has guided whatever decision making that I have to make, and that I'm accountable to my community, because I know that they will approach me and have a conversation about it and let me know of what would have been a decision or a policy that maybe I have enacted or haven't, that my community would see any Sikh elected pursue that. And that can be as simple as creating a park where my community gathers and the Sikh community sits and congregates and shares in their dukh and sukh and sit in a public space. And I say that because there's a park pending that is being built in my community, and it's Bujurgs at the Gurdwara on Sundays who are saying to me, like, Manpreet Park nahi banaya haje. And I'm like, Baba ji bas ban wala, just hang on, I promise it's coming. But that's me being accountable to them and making sure that I deliver on this promise that I've made. And I would say that, everything is a choice. It's a decision that we make, and whether we align with a certain political ideology, I am just hopeful that we make sure that first and foremost it answers to our Sikhi. And when having conversations with youth who um, and making sure that, the question was that they don't fall prey to some of these political ideologues. Really, it's making sure that there's something more that is grounding them. It isn't just political like any ideology, that there's something within them that they can answer to that is above any political leaning one way or another. I think, being a political ideology is a spectrum, and a spectrum for a reason, because it can shift every day, and um, for each issue, you may fall one way or another, and on a different way, you may move on the spectrum a little bit there. So, my encouragement to youth is always make sure you're answering to something bigger than even that system, and we're so lucky to have something that can guide us there. But also just teasing out some of these issues and knowing that. while representation matters, it's just the beginning, and representation only matters when the policy that comes out of that representation also reflects how I feel as a Sikh, and it is a responsibility. It's a choice to come into elected office, and that choice is made with enormous, uh, of course, responsibility, but also a duty to who we identify with. If I'm proudly Singh, I am proud of having the first, that the community was able to create the first Sikh seat on the city council. What does that mean? It means that the person in that seat will make sure that policy thinks of everyone from that seat in a way that any Sikh anywhere in the world would say, I don't, I'm not disappointed by any decision made there. I'm not disappointed by any words that are said by this person. So, it comes with responsibility, but there's also beauty in that. There's beauty in being able to go further and do more. Um, and then I can transition into answering, hopefully that answered some of the second question a little bit, but key barriers for Sikhs coming into political spaces. And I hope that our program at the Sikh Coalition, I hope that Takht answers that in some ways, where burdens and barriers faced by previous generations of Sikhs coming into political spaces may be alleviated if there's this shared knowledge bank. And being strategic about policies, I've gone as far as saying that there's a need for having like a Sikh political agenda, and making sure whether it's services that can be offered, that there are certain things that we as an elected official community are able to do and agree on, that would be in service to our community, and that being a strategy of how we build our identity and our presence within elected spaces. So I think there's something, while there was a prolonged vacuum in terms of having Sikhs in elected spaces, um, I almost feel that, the absence is no accident in terms of our waves of migration. I think momentum is exactly that. It's a wave. You see that something can be possible in one corner of our country, and that has a ripple effect. And we see it when we celebrate others within kind of the larger South Asian diaspora, but also otherwise. Having our first African American president, at the highest office, those things significantly matter in how we see ourselves, and having a Latina Supreme Court justice. And when we see it in other communities and we see it in our own, then it opens up the doors for that to be more possible for us. And I appreciate elected office at the local level the most because it's so intimate. It's as intimate as your park is being built, or your sidewalk got repaved, or we put a bike lane in, and those small insignificant things improving people's everyday lives. But it's interacting with community one-on-one every single day that I think local politics makes it that much more special, and that being kind of our first stepping stone. And getting that practice. And I think that is not by accident either, as to why we're seeing so many Sikhs come into local office. First and foremost is the groundswell is that Sangat at the local level, hopefully pushing folks upwards to be in elected office and be a voice for others, and saying, let's start here and let's see if we can do this, and then we'll work towards what we can do next. And I think that's exactly the momentum that a Sangat can power. And I'm extremely excited to see what the next generation of Sikh leadership looks like.
Thank you for answering. What I put together is kind of like a mega question.
Yeah,
So thank you for touching on all those
okay.
points. I think it spoke to also the really beautiful relationship that you have built with your local Sangat as well, for them to feel comfortable enough to ask and approach and say like "Baat kadon banugi?"
Yeah.
Like I think it speaks to that sort of intimate relationship that we all have with our local Sangat, and also B, and how much power folks and how much respect they also have for this type of leadership, right? To say, I'm going to hold you accountable for what you said, means that they apply some kind of meaning and some kind of power to the position, right? And they respect that position, and they expect it to to do well, right? And so I think that's a really great example that you gave us. There's two last questions, and then we'll just kind of wrap up. And they are asked by Akhtar Hussain, who says it's a two-parter. One, any possibility of unity of Sikh organizations, and two, any plan to establish Sikh University by the community.
I feel far too small and humble to establish a Sikh university, but I hope someone is working on it. And I think Dr. Deol would be the right person to. I'm going to direct that seva that way, but it would be so special. You know, we've had like Khalsa College, we've had so many universities we've seen in our homelands, you know, and if that's a seva that someone is thinking of, I think that would be extremely meaningful. And the question on unity, you know, while it's unity of Sikh organizations, I think there is a unity in response when you know, when a crisis happens in our community. You know, we're able to respond in a way that allows for each organization's niche and specialty to really come forward. And I'll use our most recent example of this trucking crisis when it was a clear workers' rights violation. And at the Sikh Coalition, there's a legal team that's able to take on and represent and be the attorneys for so many cases and causes, from discrimination within schools and classrooms or within the workplaces, and now within this entire industry. And that the ability to be able to bring forward a lawsuit against the California DMV and a department institution of that size, while also having an organization like the Jakarta Movement be a plaintiff and be represented by the Sikh Coalition, and that being the community aspect of community members rising up to share their voice and be vulnerable and share their lived experiences, and join that lawsuit. And I think that's a perfect example of how community meets legal advocacy within the specialties and the niche that each Sikh organization has, while also there's so many other Sikh organizations that are able to fulfill sevas, so that we can all have a specialty and be able to fulfill so many of the different needs within our Sangha. So I look to Khalsa Aid, you know, who is able to provide immediate and urgent resources in the forms of what we cannot live without, you know, food, water, infrastructure, safety, housing, and that's certainly an expertise. And we look to Khalsa Aid and we celebrate organizations that are able to do that. But I even look at the local level. You know, we're talking about Sikh organizations, but even our local Gurdwara, you know, within the Bakersfield network, we've got 8+ Gurdwara. And so I'm still working on that unity, so I will keep everyone updated. But there is, I will say that the unity does emerge when, you know, we're all in our own corners doing our different sevas. We're excelling, you know, with Jakarta. I was just hanging out with the high school youth last week and on their college, on their high school campuses. And that's where I practiced how to speak in a cool way with high school youth. And that became, you know, that is the expertise of the Jakarta movement. While then knowing that that community experience can now shape the policy and build a program like that at the Sikh Coalition, where we'll train the next generation of Sikh elected official leaders. But knowing that young leaders are being trained at Jakarta, I think those are pipelines that are so beautiful. And and I think that should be seen as unity as well, because we're all part of the same ecosystem.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that that helps us kind of see these really, really beautiful moments of interaction, but also collaboration then between different orgs that are coming together to kind of work for similar causes. In terms of the university, I did want to take a moment to give a quick shout out to those that maybe aren't directly working on an institution like a university itself, but have had significant and such productive presence in our university system, in our education system more broadly around the US. For one, I want to give a shout shout out to Kiki Kapaniji and the Sikh Foundation for kind of coming through and supporting all these academic affairs through chairs or through events and all these sort of moments in which they have supported education at the university level. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Nirvikraj Singh at UC Santa Cruz, who has had a tremendous presence within academia as sort of a pillar of as Sikh education and in Sikh studies, right, within the U.S. Academy, and also serving as a mentor to so many of younger generation that's coming in, like myself. And then also a shout out to organizations like Sikh Coalition and the broader team at Sikh American History Project, who are working with the K through 12 level, who are trying to kind of create lesson plans and create safe spaces for our youth within these all across the country in these different institutions. And all of these things are having a tremendous impact. And so maybe the dream of the Sikh University is a bit far off, but all these folks are definitely keeping these things in mind as they're working in the causes that they're working in, right? Um, Now we have one last question. I know we have a little bit of wiggle room, so I don't want anyone to be left behind. And so this will be our last question, and we'll just kind of wrap up there. But it says, among Sikhs, there is relatively little systematic documentation of history, events, and important facts. How can we cultivate a stronger culture of documentation among our younger generation? So if you can kind of give some quick thoughts on that, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. I want to join you in giving a shout out to the Kapani family, to Dr. Kapani, whose lesson plans, whose life and legacy has become lesson plans across the world, but also, within the Sikh Coalition's lesson plans, so that education spaces, classrooms can teach the stories of Sikh Americans in a way that we learn about other stories of other folks who have invented things that we absolutely rely on and count on. And I think that's telling the Sikh American story in a way. But we have these stories to tell, and so we're grateful. I'm grateful that whether it's a Kapani collection that I've admired at so many different museums, each again like the whether it's the arts or history, whatever it may be, there's so many sevas that keep us connected as a community, as Sikhs, as our identity, in that we have such a long legacy of being well-rounded in this way, and as yourself too, Amrit, and being the academics who tell our histories and our stories in new and nuanced ways so that someone like me can understand them in a better way, is so meaningful. And I would give a shout out here also to Dr. Tejpal Singh, who is going around all of California, and I think the United States and North America, to document Sikh stories. And he is starting a project even here in Bakersfield, and our first Gurdwara that the Sangit built from the ground up. We're going to start an effort to create a museum as well as make it a historical site. And I remember bugging Tejpal years ago, and I'm like, look, our community is moving away from this institution, but this Gurdwara, even the architect was a Sikh, and it was a family who was an early resident of Bakersfield and settled Bakersfield early, and those important stories will be so important for generations to come. And I think there are so many sevas coming forward and have been, that I think it's where we read them, where those stories are kind of accumulated, is incredibly important. And spaces like this, being able to just talk about our own stories, and having that living site within the Sikh Foundation as well. And how we cultivate a stronger culture is making sure that our students continue to get access to that same knowledge, that same history, and taking them to the museums where you would see something from the Kapani collection, them being able to, maybe parents being able to take the lesson plans on someone like Dr. Kapani and others, and Bhagat Singh Thind and Dleep Singh Sond, and the migration stories of early Sikh Americans, and being able to tell those stories because they're written and they're ready for them to be shared. And there's so many Sikh academics who have been mentioned on this call, and those beyond, whose work has allowed even for me to share our story in a way that also allows for us to know that we've been here longer than we feel we've been here. And we absolutely, because I'm in California, so I'm biased here, but our Sikh Californian story, what is that, and how do we continue to tell that story from the Gadar Party and beyond? So I agree. I think I've benefited from those spaces, and we of course always have more work to do.
Amazing. Yes, there's so many ways in which we can bring, speaking as a historian, I mean, I'm gonna have to hype it up a little bit. But speaking as a historian, there's so many ways that you can help kind of support the younger generations and get them more involved in learning about the past, whether that's working with organizations like the Sikh American History Project, which is literally dedicated to this, and Dr. Tejpal Singh, who's also dedicated to this. And then you can reach out to the Sikh Foundation, who's worked on numerous events that kind of work that highlight and amplify our Sikh American past. Whether that's looking at museum exhibits that are curated by Sikh institutions and Sikh leaders, whether that's looking through Sikh Coalition and they're organizing events that they host as well. Or even kind of reaching out to academics around, right? We're always very eager to talk about it, and we rarely have an audience. So there's many ways to get involved. Even Jakarta does Sikh History Day, right? And so there's so many ways to get involved. And so if that's a passion of someone's, then reach out to one of us. Thank you so much, Manpreet, for giving us your time, giving us your wisdom, kind of bringing us here to be able to learn more about yourself, your career trajectory, your personal trajectory, your relationship with Sikhi, and also showing us effective leadership, right? We have many hopes that are associated with you, and we don't want that to seem like a burden, but to be as a fuel that's empowering you throughout this. I want to thank everyone here at Sikh Foundation, the audience as well. And Manpreet, if there's anything you want to say before we wrap up.
Thank you. Just a tremendous honor. I still pinch myself every time I get to I'm like, what can I share that is, you still just feel so small because you're like, I'm just your local gal. I'm, just from around the block. And when you've shared space with folks who you deeply respect, and folks here at, you just, it's deeply, deeply humbling, and it's an incredible blessing to be able to share whatever this journey so far has been, and how the work continues. I'm always eager to make sure that we can be connected in new and different ways and talk about our Sikh community. And so I'm incredibly thankful to the organizers and those who continue to keep the efforts going to make sure that our Sikh voices are at the forefront. So thank you so much. It's been such an honor to share. And so any from myself, any Bolchuks, please forgive me for those. And I look forward to hopefully meeting some of you in person someday and being connected. But please stay in touch. And if I can ever be of service, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, again for joining us in the first session of our Six in Action series. Catch the next parts. They will be publicly announced, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.